Okay, so and to be honest, I'm still working through the title, but for now, I made it kind of theatrical. Franca Rame presents multiple oppressions. So known widely as a stage and screen actor, but less recognized as a writer and producer, Franca Rame was one of the most visible and pioneering presences in post-war Italy. Deeply engaged in Marxist theory and politics, concerned for the working classes and women, her main medium of expression was the stage, which she shared regularly with Dario Fo, who came to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1997. The brilliance of his craft and the criticism shined almost exclusively on him has unquestionably obscured her contributions, which can be mined for their value in theater studies, political thought, and feminism. More than that, however, Rame is a Virgilian guide through the layers of post-war intellectual and social histories in which women protested not just for equal opportunity, but for an existential reconsideration of their history and value in Italian society. For this paper, I'm interested in exploring how Rame embraced subversive and transgressive tactics, both on stage in her solo theater and offstage in her own life, to challenge the extent to which women could be accepted as politically engaged intellectual artists in the 20th and 21st centuries. Rame models a highly integrated activism in which performance is an intentional component to her public persona, while at the same time she seamlessly integrates political organizing into her already highly charged performances. So today I'd like to offer a brief overview of Rame's life, take a look at her play Il Risveglio, or The Awakening, and finally analyze the ways in which she turned subverting convention into a form of activism for both her theatrical practice and in her life. Rame was born in the summer of 1929 while fascism was well underway in the midst of the Ventennio, or the 20 years during which Mussolini ruled, to a family of traveling players known as the Compagnia Famiglia Rame. Rame's grandfather, Pio Rame, founded the company that was then passed on to her father, Domenico Rame, and it was a full family affair, with her mother, Emilia Baldini, who was originally a school teacher, often playing the leading lady, designing costumes, and assisting in management. Her two older sisters and brother acted on stage as well. Though originally specializing in puppetry during Nonno Pio's days, the company shifted to actors under the leadership of Domenico and his brother, Franca's beloved uncle Tommaso, specifically in the tradition of the Commedia dell'arte. And there's some confusion, really, about the company's proximity to the Commedia, insofar as a number of scholarly texts state that the family of traveling players dates back all the way to the 17th century, possibly among the early Commedia troupes whose very practices of improvisation had originated only a century before that. These sources are based on an interview with Rame herself. And while I don't wish to disparage any oral history or challenge Rame's account of her own family, I think it's fair to assume some critical distance and be open to the possibility of the ways in which family lore, especially her family, a family of talented storytellers and story spinners, might have embellished their ancestry. Whether or not the Famiglia Rame actually traces their ancestry back to the 17th century itinerant performers during the sunset years of the Commedia, what is important about the family's account of their past is the extent to which they identify as part of that tradition, both the theatrical style and the life. So not only would Rame's childhood in an itinerant theater company that worked to some degree, if not performing, so in costumes, assembling sets, 364 days a year, have shaped her views of the world and work, but it means that training as an actor was integrated into her private life. There was little to no separation of work and non-work, both in her own youth and in what she witnessed of the adult lives around her. So I'll draw on this lack of distinction in my concluding remarks to understand the ways in which Rame integrated her activism into her art and her theater into her socio-political interests. I also want to footnote here the importance of Rame's family in Dario Fo's art. So when they met in 1951 for the summer festival Sette Giorni a Milano, Fo, having formally trained at this point as a visual artist at the famed Accademia Brera, and only recently exploring acting, was on a much more traditional path working with establishment actors and directors. Establishment, though certainly experimental, innovative, even avant-garde. Names like Franco Parenti, Giorgio Strehler, and Paolo Bassi. In knowing and loving and working with Rame, he also found his professional rhythms in her family's home and style of theater practice. Regarding her socio-political interests, Rame was most attracted to Marxist theory and discourses on class, even though she recognized what today one would call its intersectionality with gender. And I place her work on class and gender in more deliberate conversation with each other to demonstrate her insights and actions in both areas. In her collection of monologues, Tutta casa, letto e chiesa, or All Home, Bed and Church from 1977, for example, Rame depicts portraits of women in everyday moments that display gender and economic inequities and a deep existential malaise, raising awareness of women's conditions through satire, body comedy, and drama, but tightly woven into class consciousness. In addition to her comedic techniques to address women's struggles, she also uses more tragic tones to confront class and even racial politics in such plays as La Signora Non è da buttare, which mocked capitalism in the United States, and Fedain, which told autobiographical accounts from Palestine. Her monologues display deliberate stylistic choices across a creative continuum from tragedy to comedy, and also demonstrate political commitment and fearlessness with which she privileged an attempt to hold conversation despite real threats on her life that eventually did lead to terrible violence. So now we should have time to look at some of the choices she made in Il Risveglio from her 1977 monologue collection, All Home, Bed and Church. Il Risveglio, or The Awakening, is one of her better-known monologues, praised for its breakneck slapstick comedy of a distressed woman rushing to leave her home for her factory job while getting her baby ready for daycare after a fairly sleepless night. She does silly things, grotesque and outrageous, but played for maximum laughter, like when she means to put talcum powder on her baby, but instead, in her fog of exhaustion, grabs grated Parmesan cheese. Never to miss an opportunity to comment on class consciousness, when she realizes she grabbed the cheese, she carefully brushes it off the doll onto a plate, explaining, quote, "It's too expensive to waste. I'll put it in the minestrone tonight. Anyway, my baby's bum is quite clean," end quote. So now, unable to locate her keys, she has to retrace her evening to help jolt her memory. While her descriptions, still highly comedic, resonate as a satire of women's unpaid labor at home, her intervention is more overtly geared toward a critique on class. She remembers while she was bathing the baby, she heard her husband Luigi coming home because she had forgotten her key on the inside part of the door, so that from the outside the key would not work, and she heard him scratching at the door and swearing and angry. She mocks him and his mood when he comes in, but neither one engages in any domestic argument. Rather, he replies, quote, "It isn't you, it's that fucking train, an hour late, an hour and a half to do 20 miles. Who pays me for that time?" End quote. So this opens the door then to her incisive conversation on the relationship between the oppression of workers and the multiple oppression, to use the term coined by Black feminist Deborah K. King in 1988, building on the notion of double jeopardy as theorized by Black feminist Frances M. Beale from her 1969 pamphlet. So frequently, this double jeopardy, multiple oppressions, frequently experienced by female caregivers and workers, is an oppression that, as King argued, is more than doubled, but multiplied in incalculable ways. Rame's character shoots back, quote, "Don't take it out on me. The boss steals your traveling time and you get mad, but what about my time? I work for him and then I skivvy for him at home as well. It's all for the multinational boss, the family, the sacred family. You go home to an all-purpose wife," end quote. So she adds then a litany of, quote, wifely duties that include pleasing her husband's sexual appetite. You go home to, quote, a shock absorber mattress. We regenerate you for free, and the next day we send you back to the factory as good as new so you can work even harder for the multinational. He makes depression, inflation, the galloping economic crisis, the slow economic crisis, the falling lira, the euro dollar, the petrodollar, end quote. Though quick and on the heels of her absurdist descriptions of rushing out the door, she ventures quite a sophisticated argument against global capitalism as a far-reaching patriarchal system that has precipitated economic crisis across nations as it upsets any possible equilibrium in ordinary families like hers. My favorite lines come next when Luigi jibes, quote, "Oh, ho, I didn't know I was married to a women's lib radical. Since when have you been listening to the feminists?" End quote. And she corrects him, quote, "Listen, stupid, I don't need to listen to the feminists to find out we lead a shitty life," end quote. So she takes the audience away from gender for this moment, emphasizing that he too, they as a family, suffer under the work conditions their company asks of them. But then she immediately brings back her gendered perspective, quote, "I want to be able to talk to you. Talk. I mean, it's okay with me that your problems are my problems, but why can't my problems be your problems too, instead of yours being mine and mine only mine," end quote. Structurally, this is the climax of the play. It ends soon after, when she has everything ready to run out the door to work, baby, keys, jacket, bus pass, and realizes it's Sunday, the one day off, and she wishes she could go back to bed and dream of a system in which people have a different relationship to work. When Rame wrote this play in 1977, it was an important time for women in Italy who were highly organized and enacted many changes legally and culturally. There were big victories: the right to legal abortion in 1978, which was not under threat in Italy at this time. The right to divorce, first in 1970, withstanding a referendum to repeal such a right in 1974, but also significant groups that began to form, advancing some of the most important feminist theories even today. So I'm thinking here of art historian and feminist Carla Lonzi, who in 1970 formed the controversially separatist all-female Rivolta Femminile, the Women's Revolt group, with painter Carla Accardi and the Italian Eritrean journalist Elvira Banotti. In the same year that Rivolta Femminile plastered their first manifesto along the walls of Rome shortly before forming, they created their own press, which swiftly published Lonzi's highly influential Sputiamo su Hegel, or Let's Spit on Hegel. So by inviting her readers to spit on Hegel, Lonzi clearly shifts the focus from the courts to the universities with the high stakes claim that one cannot fix an existential problem with a juridical solution. Famously, she noted, quote, "Equality is a juridical principle, what is offered as legal rights to colonized people and what is imposed on them as culture," end quote. The problem for women, in her view, and later expounded upon by the Libreria delle Donne di Milano, was that they had been written out of history. Closer to Rame's interests was the Lotta Femminista group founded by Silvia Federici and Maria Rosa della Costa, in some ways an outgrowth of Potere Operaio, which was a Marxist workerist group that largely left out the plight of women. So Federici, della Costa, Leopoldina Fortunati, and others sought to remedy that by writing treaties and raising awareness about women's invisible labor at home. In starting their Pay for Housework campaign, which to a degree was always a theoretical endeavor with the aim of consciousness raising as the highest goal, they plainly stated that women's contributions to the workforce, both in terms of the reproduction of the next generation of laborers and in terms of care work for existing laborers, needed to be taken seriously. And why shouldn't it be compensated? Finally, the Libreria delle Donne di Milano and Diottima wrote their most influential writings in the 1980s. And I want to signal how La Libreria in particular built off of Lonzi's work, both in terms of its theoretical position, emphasizing an existential crisis over a legal one, and developing a theory of sexual difference in an actionable praxis that its members hoped would begin to create a blueprint for new structures and cultures in which women were the subjects and not the objects of discourse. So here's where the subversion comes in. Rame did not belong to any of these feminist organizations, nor political ones like Potere Operaio, but she clearly supports women and reads capitalism as a multi-level threat. In fact, her political commitments continued with great passion and ingenuity offstage, perhaps most evident in the founding of the human rights group Soccorso Rosso Militante in 1972 that assisted political prisoners and brought awareness to their treatment. She even edited a book based on the diaries of a political prisoner's mother, in addition to speaking at countless public events about the treatment of political prisoners. So in a sort of double subversion, a surprise from a somewhat anarcho lifestyle, she eventually went mainstream by winning a seat on the Italian Senate. At their shows, Franca Rame regularly walked through their audiences as part of the letter writing campaigns or fundraising on behalf of political prisoners. And they also talked with their audiences from the stage, both before and after their shows. So there was a very interactive component. Rame's feminism specifically, but also her political intervention more broadly, was to translate the discourses all around her into a language for the stage. She mocked them in satire, she exploited them through the grotesque, and she also served them up in realist notes of a slightly tragic pitch, as when she says, quote, quite plainly in Il Risveglio, quote, I mean, it's okay with me that your problems are my problems, but why can't my problems be your problems too? Her practice of subversion, or the ways in which she undermined authority, were intimately linked to the stage as a site of free thinking and conversation starting. Quoting back to the public, the discourse is underway in militant groups across Italy, and then in the way that she almost seamlessly continued that work off stage. For Rame, just as it was when she was growing up in a theater company where bedtime stories grew into full stage productions and affectionate uncles turned into terrifying traitors before an audience, there was little separation between her life and her work, her art and her activism. She puts into perspective some of the myths that circulate today of ideals for which we ought to strive, like a work-life balance. As many of us know, ultimately, there's little separation between work and life, and the metaphor of balance has largely been detrimental. Perhaps in embracing that experience, if it's a familiar one, we open ourselves to read Rame's performance in yet another way, the converging of passions and their full integration across life and work through a praxis that is not exploitative